I'm heartbroken to see our gopher tortoises suffering. And in fact, I feel like the way I often approach this is you have to find ways to laugh and be hopeful, or you're just going to be crying all the time.
We have devastated not only Florida's ecosystems, but the ecosystems of the world. Every day, tortoises are getting buried alive.
I think Florida really needs to look at ensuring we have this for our future generations and that they're not just living in a concrete city.
Gopher tortoises, first of all, I think are incredibly charming and really ubiquitous across the landscape, despite the fact that their populations are in decline. They live in upland habitats, which include savannas and forests and even coastal dunes. And they're a really critical part of the ecosystems they live in. In fact, they're called keystone species because of that. But what's important to note is that the well-being of gopher tortoises is intimately linked to the well-being of our upland ecosystems here in Florida.
So the gopher tortoise burrow is the beating heart of Florida's terrestrial systems. Up to date, it's believed 411 species, according to the Asst book, that are recorded utilizing the gopher tortoise burrow, and that number is growing every year. And from insects utilizing the burrows to mice species, rat species, amphibian species, snake species, even when storms come in, a lot of bird species dive down the burrows, gaining cover. We've captured skunks coming out of burrows. Animals use them to raise offspring. They use them to escape forest fire. They use them to escape predators. They use them to overwinter during the colder months. They use them to hunt. The list goes on and on. I mean, when you lose that burrow to an ecosystem, every single species in that ecosystem is affected one way or another. My name is Chase Pirtle, and I manage the Asst Biological Preserve. I also do land restoration, outreach education with the community. We breed critically endangered species for genetic dispersal. I also train first responders, military, how to work around venomous snakes. I've been a part of the gopher tortoise world, which is called Gopher Tortoise Game, for about 10 years now. I've noticed an increase in human population around the preserve. If you add one person up here, it's a pretty significant increase in population, but just not the population, but and here comes more domestic animals, here comes more vehicles on the road, creating more obstacles for the tortoises. So just one person coming to a new environment can add loads of stress to a tortoise.
My name is Kim Titterington, and I am a wildlife rehabilitator for Swamp Girl Adventures Reptile Rehab. Basically, we do education for the public, but then on the inside, we do a lot of rehabilitation of reptiles specifically. So that's mostly turtles and tortoises, but we also cover snakes, lizards, frogs, and such too.
My name is Elise Bennett, and I am the Florida Director and a Senior Attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity. I've lived in Florida my whole life, and so gopher tortoises were one of the first species that I really got to interact with and learned was an imperiled species. So they're really near and dear to my heart. So development impacts gopher tortoises in many different ways. The most obvious one is it just destroys places for them to simply exist. But beyond that, we also see these cascading effects on the landscape. For instance, development fragments existing habitat. So even if we develop one area but we leave the others, we potentially separate gopher tortoise populations from each other. And that means that gopher tortoises can't meet to mate and to procreate and continue to the next generation. Fragmentation has a really awful impact on the species when roads are developed through habitat. We see increased road deaths to gopher tortoises when cars hit them on the road. We see more opportunities for people who wish to do gopher tortoises harm to reach them. Fragmentation also makes gopher tortoises more vulnerable to pets like dogs and cats. And so all of these things combined cause a greater impact to the species than it even appears just by that initial development. And we're seeing that development targeted towards uplands, these pine upland forests that were prolific across the Southeast. And we know now that only about 3% of the historic extent of these pine forests remains, these longleaf pines. That means that we've lost 97% already. And so we're just fighting to protect that last 3% and any other habitat where we can find the gopher tortoise. History is so critical here because it tells us that we've already lost so much and we have still even more to lose. For a long time in Florida, when someone was developing a piece of land, they were allowed to just proceed with construction and basically bury gopher tortoises in their burrows, something that we call entombment.
An entombment is basically when a tortoise is trapped. So it's like being in a tomb. And in the gopher tortoises, they can actually make their holes quite deep. So if you collapse that whole front of the burrow, they're way down at the bottom. And at that point, they have no escape. So if you take concrete, like a lot of these places have, they put a foundation of a home over top of a burrow, then when the tortoise comes out to the top, he's coming as far as he can go to where the sand is impacted, which probably isn't very far, and he's hitting the top. And all they're going to do is keep scratching and scratching and scratching, using every bit of energy that they have until they just get so weak from dehydration and starvation that their bodies basically start to eat themselves. All of their fats and reserves and all of those things are being, eaten away, trying to survive all that time. It's an extremely painful death. It ends up in organ failure, renal failure, and then the dehydration. And it doesn't happen fast. It's 6 months, maybe a year, that they could be living like that, scratching and scraping and trying to get out.
Before 2008, Florida essentially allowed anybody to take a gopher tortoise, and take means to harm, harass it, or kill it even. And this was done on a permitted basis by something called an incidental take permit, or an ITP. And there are some legacy incidental take permits that still allow a developer to move forward and entomb those tortoises.
So with the incidental take permits, there were 104,000 tortoises buried on paper. The reason FWC grandfathered in everybody with the ITPs instead of nixing them is because they don't have the animal's interest at heart. It is the economy, and it's not in the best interest of the animal.
In 2008, the state of Florida decided to set up a program where tortoises would have to be relocated out of the way of development. But one critical issue with this program is that its aim is to have no net loss of gopher tortoises. But there isn't a similar aim to have no net loss of habitat. And so no matter what happens, we're always losing a bit more habitat every time we have development. And that means that we are moving essentially the same number of tortoises into smaller and smaller areas in the state.
Recipient sites are only 200 acres, 400 acres, and that's not enough to allow functionality. Because once again, you're talking about an animal that has an incredibly long lifespan, produces a lot of offspring, and 400 acres is not going to sustain a population. Is there disease inhabiting this ecosystem prior to putting the tortoises there? What's the surrounding habitat around the recipient site that the tortoises are going to? A lot has to be brought into play, and a lot is not brought into play with the relocation program.
Essentially, this program is like a Band-Aid, or it's something that makes us feel good, but doesn't really address the true threat to the species, which is loss of habitat. The reason I got into conservation was because of an experience that I've heard from many other lifelong Floridians, and it's seeing some of the natural places that I love slowly disappear to strip malls and roads and planned developments.
Definitely over the years, areas that you would go and visit and there's gopher tortoises kind of doing their thing out grazing and wildlife. It's like now there's a shopping center or a parking lot.
Witnessing and experiencing that loss really drove me to do whatever I could to try to protect these amazing places before they're all gone. So over the past few years, what we've seen is just escalating development across the landscape for the gopher tortoise. And in 2021, that started to come to a head. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission had identified that we were running out of places to put gopher tortoises. So the FWC issued this emergency executive order. They acknowledged we have a shortage of recipient sites, but we have all these developers that want to move forward with their plans, and we need to find some way to continue to let that go forward. And so what they essentially did is they rolled back some of those protections that help make relocation less stressful for gopher tortoises. This executive order was extremely concerning because the whole need for it came about because we were seeing development come to a head and become a real, right in front of us, conservation issue for the tortoise. We need to hold tight to our protections. We need to do everything we can to make sure these tortoises have all the protections they need to be supported as they're relocated. But instead, the agency rolled back those protections to allow the continued development that had caused the problem in the first place. And that's when we became incredibly concerned just about the strength of this entire program. We already know that it's not protecting habitat the way we need it to, and now we're seeing that even these populations that are being relocated, they're not being given their best shot at survival. And so what we've seen is what immediately at the time had looked like maybe a blip or an issue we just needed to get past as an emergency is becoming a long-term problem. So the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commissioners are appointed by the governor and then approved by the Senate, and they sit for a term of 5 years each. And then it's up to the commissioners to decide the fate of many conservation issues in the state, including what happens to our gopher tortoises. In October of 2021, there was a House committee meeting where the House was able to ask questions to an official from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission.
The State Affairs Committee will now come to order. Members, please take your seats.
And during that meeting, many of our legislators had questions about driving down the cost of relocating a gopher tortoise. And those prices, in a lot of ways, are the only thing standing between the loss of the rest of the gopher tortoise's habitat and these developers.
What is it that's exactly driving up the cost?
What's driving the cost?
The increase in cost.
Would it be possible to monitor the cost?
Soon after that meeting, we saw a bill introduced. We saw Senator Travis Hudson introduce Senate Bill 494, which was supposed to make some changes to the way we manage gopher tortoises here in the state. Driving down costs means essentially giving a green light to the very development that's causing the drive towards extinction for this species. This bill was not about protecting gopher tortoises, but it was really a handout to developers.
Is there any objection to that motion? Anyone? Anybody want to object to that? Anybody? Okay, no. So show that motion adopted.
This year, I've seen over 500 reptiles that have been injured. Most of those are turtles and tortoises. A lot of them are females with eggs. You know, they're just out trying to do their business.
You know, often the thing that really keeps me up at night is worrying that the gopher tortoises are going to reach a point where we can no longer save them, and we won't even know it yet.
It's like when they say, you know, once you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated, right? So why are we going to wait until there is a problem with gopher tortoises before we start acting on it?
I grew up in the pine forests of upland Florida. These are the places that I love. And to think that we're replacing that with lifeless concrete, with strip malls that are empty, it's just nonsensical to me, and it really hurts me deeply. And that's kind of what drives me to stay positive and keep working, is that The alternative is just letting it happen.
There's great people doing great things out there, but we're in need of reinforcements, we're in need of finances to continue this good work, to make it where we can do this good work of a point of magnitude where it really, really matters.
I think what it comes down to is education, a lot more community outreach, getting people empowered to start a club, an awareness group, a tortoise watch group in their neighborhood.
It gives me hope that if we can garner the political will to motivate our state government and our federal government to give us the tools we need and to help put that comprehensive plan in place for recovery, that we could really do this.
From the politician to the private individual, everybody has to get involved.
If you care about gopher tortoises, there's something you can do. Whether it's protecting habitat on your own land, whether it's assisting a tortoise across the road so it doesn't get hit by a car, all the way up to those bigger picture items, informing our legislators about what's going on. If we were all calling our legislators and informing them and pushing them to not adopt that bill, we could have had a really different outcome.
You see this little glimmer of hope that there's still people out there who are going to take the time to help them.
We still have a great chance to find a great medium that we can come to as a species to coexist to the natural world, but we have to act now.
And so it gives me great hope that there's still somewhere for us to go. The species isn't gone yet. And I think that if we could make some big changes soon, we could really make a big difference for the gopher tortoise.